Hello, and thank you for joining us for episode 8 of our Overshadowed series, where we'll be discussing data privacy and legal issues introduced by generative AI. I'm Russ Spitler, CEO and co-founder of Nudge Security, and with me today is Bradley Gold, VP at ARCatar, and executive educator on topics including ethics, compliance, data, privacy, and more. Brad, thanks for joining me. This is a conversation I've really been looking forward to.
Good morning. Yeah, it's good to see you and nice for us to have this conversation in front of a whole bunch of other people too.
Awesome. So we've been hearing a lot about the benefits of leveraging generative AI when it comes to productivity gains and innovations. As with any new emerging technology, there's also the challenge when accessing new risks as challenges introduce. But given the rapid adoption curve of generative AI, it's been challenging, to say the least, for companies to catch up when it comes to governance. In your work with clients, how does the conversation about AI go? What are the most frequently asked questions about the concerns that come up?
Oh gosh, that's a big question to get things started. Um, I think how the conversations go regarding AI is a reflection of all the different places that we're seeing AI. Some conversations are pretty simple and straightforward, and other conversations, I've got clients that are halfway down the water slide and wondering, how do I not get wet? And my response then is, it might already be a little late, but let's see if we can at least get you a towel waiting for you on the other side. So the conversations about AI sometimes that they're simple and straightforward. If somebody just wants to know, what am I looking at? What am I reading in this article? What does AI mean? What is generative AI versus regular AI? If somebody has heard about AI things before. Um, and the questions that follow are really a reflection of people's level of understanding, what kind of business they're in, and what kind of issues it is that they're facing. Because data privacy and working through legal and data and governance issues is heavily dependent on the context and what type of data we're talking about. For example, it's a much different conversation if we're talking about protecting people's data and identity related to medical records that might be subject to some type of AI system. And that's quite a different scenario than somebody who might be relying on AI for some aspect of home security or something that provides convenience to them in their workday. So, how the conversation goes really is a back and forth where one of the first things I tend to ask is, okay, if you have a question about AI, tell me exactly how you're thinking of using it. And then we can back out the kinds of things that we need to discuss and know about to use it responsibly and safely.
It's really interesting to hear you describe that because a lot of the conversations that I've had with customers are really about getting visibility into who exactly is using this type of technology. And then it comes along the lines of, well, are they sharing corporate IP? Are they sharing customer information? Are they just using this to refine their communication style? And that seems to fold directly into the sort of concerns that you just brought up, because those are wildly different legal and sort of risk related concerns as it comes up with those different use cases.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And clients if somebody is aware enough of the fact that they don't know how to deal with something and they reach out to me to start a conversation, that's always a great first step. And even if people don't know what to do to protect themselves or to understand the technology, how and where to use it responsibly, um, that's a different conversation than the folks that are just ignorant or blissfully ignorant in some way of the technology even being out there. So the fact that people are even beginning to reach out, I think, it's a subtle but very strong and fantastic first step in all of us understanding generative AI and both the promise and benefits that it can deliver alongside some of the consequences and drawbacks and concerns. And again, the use case is what really defines the consequences and the concerns that we have. As an example, if a company was to use AI to help it find its next employee, well, at least in the state of New York tells companies, yes, you could use AI for that process. However, you need some human oversight because that's a really important decision. And generative AI that helps people make decisions still has biases. It was still created by people that hopefully are trying their hardest and doing their best, but still that human behavior element can make its way into the code, which then makes its way into the automated decision making. And then sometimes we don't get the best decision that gets that is created on the other side. And so that employment situation is though quite a bit different than lots of other applications. And what they say in New York is different than what they're saying in California or Texas or elsewhere.
It's really interesting to consider that piece, and we've long since talked about bias in AI models as it relates to image recognition, character recognition, etc. But it's really interesting to start to think about that in the broader sort of regulatory landscape in terms of processes that you're trying to optimize using this new technology, and where you might be introducing bias that you didn't intend to as a result.
Yeah, and the human behavior piece, again, is probably the least understood and oftentimes the least paid attention to piece of the puzzle because AI technology and specifically the generative AI products that have come out in the market in this calendar year 2023 are all the shiny, bright new toys that everybody wants to play with, have fun with, get on Chat GPT and see what you can make it do. And maybe I can figure out how to use this at work today. And especially over the summer, we saw this flood of people just playing with the bright, shiny new thing. And some of the outcomes of that were really interesting, sometimes newsworthy. Other times, the uses and outcomes of generative AI, such as in the courtroom, terrible idea. Don't do it. You're going to run into problems. Um, but we don't necessarily find that out until this stuff gets released into the public and people start playing with it and using it, so that we actually start to understand what is appropriate and what isn't. And some of this is predictable, but also some of it is not. And that's because of the human behavior element. And that's a place where we have this nice intersection between privacy and cybersecurity and AI and other kinds of tech conversations, because no matter how advanced and layered the technology is, the human behavior piece, the human being is part of the puzzle. It's not just a human being that types things onto a keyboard and then other stuff happens. It's it's technology and products that are made by people that are ultimately supposed to be for people. Because to me, at least, the greatest promise of generative AI is that it's supposed to save time. It's supposed to help us do things that we couldn't just do on our own, or even if we could, it might take us forever. And so we have to think about, we have people on both ends of the spectrum of this generative AI technology that's in the middle. People are making it, and it's supposed to be out here to make our lives better. So what we often need to spend our days doing is looking at the stuff in the middle based on what we know is happening on the outside to try to make the whole thing actually work and change people's lives the way that many of us say that we're going to, and the way that we hope that many of our products actually will. Some of them do, but the ones that fail, I think, are the ones that typically take into account that there's people on both ends of the spectrum when we think through the technology or product or data life cycles of these technologies.
It's a really interesting aspect, and I know obviously you're passionate about that particular area. As you think about the far end of one of those sides in terms of the actual people using it, what do you think are the best ways to kind of inform, educate, and enforce appropriate usage policies for AI within those organizations?
Well, without getting into all the variety packs of use cases, I think common sense is the best guidepost. Now, many of us know that common sense isn't always that common, but it's still a really good starting point because there's some basic aspects of common sense that many of us, if not all of us, really do share. For example, we want trust in our relationships. If we have a relationship with another human being or a product or a company, we want some level of trust that who or whatever is on the other side is going to meet, or if we're lucky, even exceed our expectations. So when we think about developing expectations around the uses of these generative AI products, I don't think And I don't think common sense tells us that this is actually going to completely change our lives. And none of us are going to have to lift a finger. None of us are going to have to work. None of us are going to have to drive anywhere, make food. Everything's just going to be done for us. No, that's some silliness that we hear in news stories sometimes, and maybe some optimism, or somebody's watched too many sci-fi movies, and maybe one day things will be at that point. But for right now, the more that we envision these AI products to just be doing anything and everything for us, we're going to be disappointed. We're going to be frustrated. We're going to be sad and waiting for the next thing and spending too much money on the stuff that doesn't get us there. And so developing reasonable common sense expectations about the role of this technology in our lives is, I think, the key guidepost to bringing the technology into our lives, and then also educating ourselves in understanding this stuff. If we actually look at AI for what it is, and any particular AI product or generative AI product for what it really is, it's cool, it's interesting, it's definitely an advancement from where products were before, but it's not the absolute life-changing paradigm shift that is going to make yesterday completely different than tomorrow. So I think if we start there, then we can actually have really good conversations about generative AI and what it means for each of us. And then it's easier to get into those specific use cases too.
It's interesting to think about that. And one of the reactions that I've seen out there with any new technology is, hey, I'm going to bring it in house and I'm going to control it. And then I'm going to know it's going to be safe. When you kind of think about that approach in this world, where somebody might want to, establish their own internal LLM where they control what training data is going into it and how it's being managed. Um, how do you sort of think about the sort of privacy concerns in those scenarios? How does a company sort of like manage that balance between I'm going to control it all and run the technology, or I'm going to establish trust with these third party providers?
Mm. So I think this is a choice that many businesses and engineers and business people struggle with. And we're all looking for that trustworthy place to begin the conversation. And I think you lay that out really nicely, because for some folks, it makes sense to find that quote unquote trusted third party to work with and have that be your anchor point to build technology around it. Other folks say, actually, all of what's out there is not great. I'm going to bring this in house and create my own version of it, because then my expectations will be met and I know how this will work. And in my line of work, of course, the entry point to that conversation, and do I select the outside vendor versus do I get this myself, is a data related conversation. The origins in that conversation are somebody's thinking about the data that gets input into these systems, or they're thinking about the data that comes out, because both are equally important and both have substantial business implications as well as legal and other data privacy implications. So I think the short version of this is, if somebody wants to create or bring in a model in house, if they're working with a product that was created by, let's say, OpenAI's Chat GPT product, where you can bring that in and build your own layers around the nucleus that they provide to you. Perhaps for some companies, the issues about how the model was trained and where that data came from might be a little bit less of an issue if they're really training it for something that is a specific use, where the training data has been legitimately sourced and it has been thoughtfully sourced. And on the outside, in terms of the outputs, this is an area that, interestingly, I think remains a mystery to most people, because very few people actually took the time to read through all the documentation of any of the generative AI models that are out there. And if you were like me and just spent hours and hours and hours reading through all the terms and conditions and the privacy policies, and by the way, for all of those folks that didn't do that out there, I don't blame you, because it takes a long time. These things are not easy. But when you read through these things, and I spend so much time reading through them, stuff starts to jump off the page. And one of the things that jumped off the page to me right away was that the creators of these generative AI technologies are actually not looking to lay claim to the ownership of what comes out of these products and tools. And so it's a wonderful opportunity for business people and creators and all kinds of folks to be able to own and enjoy what they can create with generative AI. And in that sense, we're not talking about generative AI being any different than a guitar that you could go buy at Guitar Center. It's a tool that you could use and you can play and you can do something fun. And what comes out of that is yours and it's uniquely yours and it doesn't belong to anybody else. So making sure that that model also legally works is not just about the law in the United States or Canada or Mexico or North America, South America, it's global. Because if we want to post something on Twitch or Kick or YouTube, everybody in the world can see that. And that means we have to be thoughtful about not just the way things work in the USA or wherever it is somebody happens to live, but generally where this stuff works out there. And that's where we start getting into conversations about other laws that maybe we don't always think about, like GDPR, for example. But why that's important to remember here is that GDPR lays out rights for human beings related to their data. So again, when we think about that example of there's people on both sides of this, there's already laws out there. California, Europe, Illinois, they're all over the place regarding how the people have rights regarding the technology that's in the middle. And so as we work through the different pieces of the puzzle, you come in, you zoom out, you come in, you zoom out. And that allows the creation of technology and technology products where we can be mindful and thoughtful of, do we bring this in-house and make our own version of it? Or maybe we can trust something that somebody else built. And then what are we trying to create with these tools? And find the answer to that. Because I hate to sound like a lawyer, but the actual answer to that is it depends on what you're doing and where you are.
I'm amazed that you actually read through all those privacy agreements, and I just used ChatGPT to summarize them for me. But the interesting piece of that puzzle, and I like how you made that analogy to a tool, because ultimately it's just like computer hardware. It's going to help you get a task done, but there's no presumption of ownership. I wonder also if there's also a shifting of liability in terms of what's coming out of those models as well, right? I love now there's a nice disclaimer at the bottom of OpenAI's interface where it says this might be wrong, right? And that certainly wasn't as prevalent in the early days. And that seems like another area of risk that a lot of companies are trying to navigate today in terms of how they integrate this into core business processes, given a potential infidelity of the results.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And as is often the case with risks in the business world, fine print provides, if not the answer, at least liability protection for the folks that are putting this technology out there and hoping people use it the right way. So I'm pretty sure I saw earlier today that YouTube or maybe one of the other big platforms has decided that AI generated content has to be labeled. And
Interesting.
that shouldn't be like a huge sea change paradigm shift again. It should be a natural extension of what you just pointed out, which is that these products were actually rolled out to begin with an eye towards making a tool that could be delicately handed off to people so that you could make really cool and interesting things that you couldn't do before. And now that it's been in people's hands for a while, and the companies themselves that have alternately admitted, we're not entirely sure what we've created, or we know exactly what we've created. Well, as time goes by, regardless of which side of the conversation you're on, we know more with experience. And experience tells us we maybe ought to put, a bit of fine print in more than one place to remind people that what you are seeing, what you are watching, what you are working with, it's a tool, it's very cool, it's very interesting, but keep in mind, it might not be real. And your mind, your eyes and your ears could be playing tricks on you. And again, that's homage to the person that's at the end of that conversation.
It's really interesting, and this certainly kind of cracks open a bigger conversation. But I feel as though this is kind of one last step towards this realization that most of what we interact with in computers as well, excuse me, all of what we interact with in computers is artificial. It was constructed by somebody for the experience of the end user. And really, that's where I see a lot of the cracks that, adversaries start to exploit in terms of, taking that human behavior and your natural reactions and getting you to click on the pop-up that came up for the 50th time or accept that text message to verify your 2FA. And it sort of makes us realize that now, even as we get more human representations from the generative AIs, there's a lot less that we're going to be able to rely on our sort of innate human evolved senses to be able to discern truth from fallacy in those environments.
Yeah, it's interesting. Us human beings, just to be clear, we are human beings on this screen right now. um, Us human beings do have some unique abilities to detect things that are fake, and you can't even always put your finger on it. But we actually do a really good job at this. But the glory and problem of advancing technologies is that those technologies begin to exceed our abilities as human beings. So pointing out what is real and what is fake, maybe for us as fully grown adults isn't as important, but especially for the younger ones out there and those that are growing up with this technology as a part of their lives all along, just simply labeling this stuff so that people are aware of the fact that it's not exactly real is incredibly important for their education and understanding of the right way and the right places to use generative AI. Because one of the greatest concerns and one of the greatest risks that's very difficult to manage is simply using generative AI in places with sensitive people, sensitive data. Like I mentioned, medical records earlier. I'm not saying by any means that AI shouldn't be used in medical context. In fact, there's some great use cases for all types of AI, including generative AI within the healthcare field. But there's some very specific uses and use cases where people are sensitive, people are vulnerable, their health records have information that is none of our business. And using generative AI could then suddenly create a risk where there was not one before. So ultimately, I think we really ought to avoid creating risks where we don't need them.
Absolutely fair. When you think about sort of this transition, what do you think is most important to convey to the board and other non-IT stakeholders about AI risks?
Well, I like to remind people, as you were talking about AI and what the thought process behind it a couple moments ago, I like to remind clients, especially that are not tech native, that AI is artificial intelligence. It's a synonym for saying engineered intelligence. We are bringing in automated decision making into a business environment. And so, if I'm talking to an executive team, a manager, a board of directors, I'm providing a report or an opinion letter to a company, I am typically pointing out the risks that are associated with automated decision making in a defined environment. So, for example, if we took an autonomous vehicle and somebody wanted to use advanced AI technologies to help that vehicle drive, well, all the rules of the road, for example, say that if there's a stop sign, you absolutely must stop. But there are scenarios where a vehicle can't necessarily stop at that stop sign. For example, what if there's an ambulance coming up behind that vehicle and it's only a two-lane road? And if you don't go halfway through the stop sign, the ambulance can't get past you. And so, in a world of AI and a world of rules, pointing out the intersection between human behavior and human events versus the rule based system of AI or engineered intelligence, that's where the risks are that the leaders of a business need to be aware of and then balance and weigh out themselves. Because sometimes risks are worth it, sometimes they aren't. Sometimes they can be mitigated, sometimes they can't, but you certainly can't do anything about them if they're not pointed out.
Makes total sense. I love that closing thought. We could really go on for hours, but it's time for us to wrap today. Thanks everyone for joining, and thank you, Brad, for being our guest today. It's a pleasure to talk to you. Stay tuned for future episodes of Overshadowed, and I hope you can join us again soon.
Thank you. Bye.